Okay, at this point you should have the little square that says determine the conclusion using law of detachment. Have that taped or pasted into your notebook following this question. What is the law of detachment? The law of detachment is a logic law that follows the pattern if P then Q is true and you're given P, you conclude that Q is true. And I'm going to put this off to the side. This means conclusion or therefore. So I'll show you two examples. The first one will be true and the second one will not be true based on the logic law of detachment. So what we do is we carefully underline and put in symbols what we're reading. So if you are in Alaska, where you are in Alaska would be P, there is no billboard advertising because it's banned, would be Q. So this reads if P then Q. Well, Teresa is in Alaska. Someone being in Alaska is referring to P. So Teresa is in Alaska. So we have P then Q. P is true. So our conclusion is Q. So the conclusion would be, as it relates to Teresa, is that Teresa will not see any billboard advertising. And that would be Q. So let's look at the example number 2. If a pet is a dog, so we have P, a pet is a dog, then it chases squirrels, Q. So we have if P then Q. Then we're talking about my pet chasing squirrels. Well, a pet chasing squirrels is a reference to Q. So because it doesn't follow the format P then Q followed by P, we would say there is no conclusion because it should be P then Q followed by P, not followed by Q. So we would say no valid conclusion. The law of syllogism is if you're given the conditional statement P then Q, if that's true, and then they give you Q again with some new thought or idea, which we'll just call R, and that's true, then our conclusion is that the Q's essentially drop out. We can conclude that P then R is true. So it's actually, if you remember the transitive property of geometry or of algebra, when you had the two ideas back to back, and you could cross out the middleman and you were just left with the first and the last term. So let's see this as an example. So if the groundhog sees his shadow, so anytime we reference a groundhog seeing his shadow, that's P, then he will go back into his burrow, that's Q. If the groundhog goes back into his burrow, well, we've already talked about a groundhog going back into his burrow. If the groundhog goes back into his burrow, we already called that Q, then we will have 6 more weeks of winter. We will have 6 more weeks of winter. Well, we haven't talked about having 6 more weeks of winter, so we call that R. So Q then R. So since these Q's are back to back, our conclusion is P then R, which would be if the groundhog sees his shadow, then we will have 6 more weeks of winter. Okay, the next example, we want to see if the law of syllogism is used to draw valid conclusions. So if it is Tuesday, which is P, then Daryl works at Farm Fresh. So that's Q. So if P, then Q. If Daryl works at Farm Fresh, well, we already know that Q is Daryl working at Farm Fresh. Then he drinks a latte from Starbucks. That's R. We haven't talked about R yet. We haven't talked about Daryl drinking a latte from Starbucks, so we call it R. So now, based on the example we just did, I'd like for you to pause the video and write the conclusion using law of syllogism to write the conclusion based on the law of syllogism. So pause the video and write down your answer. Okay, and you also have to be very flexible because sometimes you're not going to see your statements given as if-then statements. So for example, let's just say I said all vegetarians do not eat meat. And then I tell you that Miss Flip is a vegetarian. What can you conclude about Miss Flip and why? So your conclusion should be that Miss Flip does not eat meat. And the law, or the reason why, would be the law of detachment. So even though I do not put it in the form, if you are a vegetarian, then you do not eat meat, it's still implied that being a vegetarian is P, not eating meat is Q. Miss Flip being a vegetarian refers to P again, so your conclusion would be Q. So you have if P, then Q. P is given, so you conclude that Q is true.